Sense. Okay, good morning. We are learning Lila Nishmas Mindel, Mariam Bas Kam, and Ruvain. Her neshama should have an aliyah. It is having an aliyah. Okay, so the last thing we discussed was the Mishnah. The last lines of our Mishnah with Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel's Machloksim. There are different debates, and we spoke about the fact that although Beis Shammai was strict about many, many cases, when it came to placing the olives or the grapes under the board that crushes them, a person is allowed to do that on Erev Shabbos, even according to Beis Shammai, right? Beis Shammai was very stringent about your utensils doing things for you on Shabbos, but over here he wasn't stringent. Why is that? And we explained the reason is because once they were crushed once you put the board down on it, then any subsequent squeezing that would happen afterwards, let's say you were to go ahead and push down on the board on Shabbos itself, it would only be rabbinically prohibited and not biblically prohibited. Again, once it was crushed once, then any subsequent crushing would only be rabbinically prohibited. And as we're going to, and that's why Beis Shammai, although in the other cases he was stringent, that's because the malacha that you would have been doing would be d'oraisa. Here it would be d'Rabbanan. It would be d'Rabbanan, and therefore he is lenient. So now we're going to discuss who is the Tana who holds that you are allowed to that once it's crushed once, it's not going to be a problem. Okay, so what we're talking about over here, just to give some background, is that there's a general prohibition of getting liquid out of a solid item. Okay, mefarig dash, basically going ahead and squeezing things. Right, so this comes up. People, squeezing a lemon on Shabbos. Right, not so simple. We'll talk about scenarios where that's allowed, but to just go ahead and start squeezing lemons and making lemon juice, that's going to be forbidden. It also has ramifications, things which are not necessarily like food items. But it comes a big question about like pumping for a woman who is nursing. If she were to pump and just get the liquid out, it's also going to be problematic without certain caveats. So bottom line is, anytime you're extracting some liquid from a solid, there is going to be an issue. Okay, so the Gemara over here is now going to discuss that there are different stages. Let's jump in. So it says the Gemara, one of the last words of Yud Testament Aleph, Mantana.
Third line from the bottom.
For a third line from the bottom. Thank you, Max. Mantana. Who is the Tana who holds that anything that comes out subsequently after you pressed once, that from a doraisa perspective, you're not going to be over any lavin, right? Because in other words, what we're saying over here is if you crush down on Shabbos itself, once you crush once, at least doraisa, you're not doing anything wrong. Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, Rabbi Shmuel, it's Rabbi Shmuel. How do we know it's Rabbi Shmuel? It's not. We have a Mishnah that says it like this: Hashum, garlic, va'boser, and unripe grapes, va'malilos, and unripe grain. This news, I did not realize this, but grain has some liquid trapped in it. And basically, you could pull out some liquid. What's it? There's a word for it actually. Was it whey? Starch? I don't know. Fine. I don't know. Maybe. Anyway, the point is that you crush it once. Shariska modiyom. Let's say you chopped it once. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Yigmar Mishtachshach, you're allowed to leave it. In other words, once you put down the initial bang, the initial board, you're allowed to allow the liquid to continue to go out on Shabbos. From Kiva Omer, Kiva says, Lo Yigmar, you're not allowed to do so after dark. You're not allowed to allow the process to finish after dark. So that's why Rav Yosef Bar Chanina said it's Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel is saying that once you press down once, you're allowed to let it continue. Clearly holding, there's no issue. Yeah.
Is that process good for the grain to be used later on, right? You don't have a need for that.
You have a need for the liquid. You're trying to get the liquid out. We're talking about scenarios where we're trying to get the liquid out. We're trying to extract the liquid. We're not talking about So
it's not preparing it for.
It's preparing it in the sense. Yeah, it's preparing in the sense that you want the liquid. You want to get the liquid out.
Right, but you want the actual. That would be. I don't know.
You want anytime you want the liquid, that's going to be dash. Right, that's going to be the okay. Mefarik, excuse me. Rabbi Lezer, Amar Rabbi Lezer. Rabbi Lezer says no. It's Rabbi Lezer. Now that sounds funny. Rabbi Lezer says it's Rabbi Lezer. Okay, so here's the deal. Rabbi Lezer. Lezer was a common name. There's Rabbi Lezer the Amora, who's people in the time of the Gemara, and there's Rabbi Lezer the Tana. So Rabbi Lezer the Amora, one of the authors, one of the people living in the time of the Gemara, says, "Oh, it's Rabbi Lezer who came before me, a few hundred years before me, i.e., the Tana Rabbi Lezer." Where do we see that? It's not. We have a Mishnah that says, "Chalos devash sheriskam erev Shabbos yotzmi atzman." First, that's honeycombs that you broke up before Shabbos, okay, and the honey starts oozing out by itself. Asr, the Tana Kama says you're not allowed to eat that honey on Shabbos. Okay, so again, you have honeycombs, and you break them open. Once you break open like juicy, good, fresh honeycombs, they start to ooze out honey. The Tana Kama says you can't touch it on Shabbos. Why can't you touch it on Shabbos? He holds because since there'd be, according to the Tana Kama, there'd be a prohibition, a biblical prohibition of crushing it further, okay? Therefore, you're not allowed to eat the honey on Shabbos. Right? The Tanna Kama holds there's a biblical prohibition of crushing it further. However, Rabbi Lazar matir. Rabbi Lazar says you're allowed to eat the honey. Why? Because he holds, although you're not allowed to continue to crush it on Shabbos, you would be allowed to only answer midoraisa, midorabanan, and not midoraisa. So once again, you have Rabbi Lazar telling you. So that's what Rabbi Lazar said. The author of our Mishnah said once you did the initial crushing of the grapes or olives, then you're allowed to leave it. It's Rabbi Lazar. Right? So one opinion says it's Rabbi Ishmael. and one opinion says Rabbi Elazar, and now the Gemara is going to analyze why did each one pick their Tana and not the other one. Okay? Let's hold on tight. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, my time Omer Rabbi Elazar. Why did Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina say that it's Rabbi Shmuel and not Rabbi Elazar? Amalach Hasam Nikara Ochel, L'Besof Ochel. In the case of the honey, it's initially food and the end it's food. Okay, in other words, Hacham Yikara Ochel v'Hashta Mashka. Whereas in the case of the grapes or olives, initially it's food and now it's a beverage. Okay, so what does that mean? What that means is as follows: that in the case of the honeycomb, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina is pushing back. He's saying that maybe Rabbi Elazar only says his halacha in the case where you break open the honeycombs, the honey's there. You can see it. The honey is like oozing out on the outside. You see honey. It's honey. The honey's just being extracted. It's not like even trapped inside of it. It's kind of like hidden. Yeah, again, the combs in the whatever those hexagon things, majigis. But the bottom line is that it's not actually, but it's liquid. You see the honey before, you see the same honey after. And therefore, that's why he says over there that any subsequent crushing is not going to be a problem, midoraisa. Whereas maybe when it comes to grapes and olives, there it's really trapped inside. There, maybe he'll say, no, there you will not be allowed to do it. So just because we have Rabbi Elazar saying by the honeycombs that midoraisa is not an issue, doesn't necessarily tell us that by the grapes and olives, it's not going to be an issue. Okay? Rabbi Elazar Amalach, Rabbi Elazar says, yeah, you're right. Fair point. However, Hashamina Lili Rabbi Elazar Dafilu Zeisman Avim Amishari. We also have a teaching that tells us Rabbi Elazar also holds of his halacha in the case of olives and grapes. Meaning, in other words, the honeycomb case is not the only source I have. Daki Asr of Hoshia min Arda, whenever Hoshia came from Narda, Asava Aisi Masnisam Bideh, he came with a brisa that said, Zaysim, meaning, you have to keep in mind, nowadays, we have everything written in front of us, and you have the whole canon in front of you. But back in the day, not everything was written down, and so people were traveling from base Spanish to base Spanish, and they bring along with them different brisas that weren't written down. So he says, yeah, Rav Hoshia came along, and he taught us the following brisa. What was that? Zaysim anavim shuskum erev Shabbos yotzmi atzman asurin. We had the brisa said that olives and grapes, which were crushed before Shabbos, and anything that came out on themselves, you cannot eat it on Shabbos. Rav Elazar, Rav Shimon matirin. However, Rav Elazar and Rav Shimon allow it. So we see clearly that Rav Elazar himself holds that it is mutter. Rav Yosef Bechanina, brisa l'shmiele. However, Rav Yosef Bechanina, the reason he didn't say Rav Elazar, he never heard this brisa. In other words, it was something which simply wasn't that well known, and that's why only Rabbi Elazar said it's Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Yosef Bechanina said it's Rabbi Shmuel. Now we flip the question. Rabbi Elazar, my time Omer Rabbi Yosef Bechanina. Why did Rabbi Elazar not say like Rabbi Yosef Bechanina? Okay, why did he not say it's Rabbi Shmuel? Amar lach lav itmar Allah Amar Rava Bar Chanina Amar Rav Yochanan. Okay, let's actually pause for a second. Just give a little bit of background, and that is that there are 3 steps to the crushing when you're trying to extract juice or oil from olives or grapes. There are 3 stages. The first is you chop it, okay? The second is that you beat it, okay? And the third is what's called shrika, which is you mash it, okay? So you cut it, you basically crush it, and then you start really mashing it, okay? So there are really 3 stages that go into the process, and as we're going to see, Rabbi Elazar is going to understand that the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel was limited in a way that wouldn't be consistent with our Mishnah. Again, let's just review what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand. Our Mishnah said that once you crush once, midoraisa, there's no issues. Okay, midoraisa, there's no issues. And we're trying to figure out who the author is. Rabbi Elazar says it's Rabbi Elazar, asking now why he didn't say it's Rabbi Shmuel, who happened to have a case which sounded quite similar to our case, but we'll see there's a bit of a difference. Let's see what is that. Lav itmar Allah. We learned in a teaching of an Amora qualifying the discussion of Rabbi Yochanan of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva that said Rabbi Bar Chanina Amar Rabbi Yochanan mimechusarin dicha duchuliyam lo pligi. When it lacks pounding, okay, and what's pounding? Pounding is the second stage. Everyone agrees lo pligi. Everyone agrees that it is forbidden to allow it to stay there. Where do they argue? They argue when it's missing the last stage. There, Rabbi Shmuel says, if it's missing the third thing, then it's mutter. And in the case of our Mishnah, only the first stage happened, right? The Mishnah said you basically drop the cover, but that's just equivalent to the first stage. Therefore, we're saying that Rabbi Shmuel, yet granted, Rabbi Shmuel says if it's missing the last stage, it's allowed. But in our case, in the case of Rabbi Shmuel, the case Rabbi Shmuel is, talking, there it's missing even, sorry. In the Mishnah, flip it. In the Rabbi Shmuel only allows in the case where it's missing the final stage. The Mishnah allows it even when it's missing the second and third stage, and that's why Rabbi Elazar says it's not Rabbi Shmuel because there's an inconsistency between them. Okay, Rabbi Yossi Bechanina Rabbi Shmuel, and we have Rabbi Yossi Bechanina ruling in accordance with the view of Rabbi Shmuel, meaning passing like this that it's allowed even when it's missing mashing. He allowed the person to put down the initial beams and allowed the person to and didn't say you have to stop and allow the person to drink any of the juice that came out subsequently on Shabbos. Okay, now we're gonna shift gears and talk a little bit about muktzah. We haven't introduced muktzah yet. Okay, my little pet peeve, which I annoy my children with, and that is that they call everything muksa. It's muksa, right? Everything's muksa. Muksa is a dirabanan. Muksa is not the most important thing on. They're all important, don't get me wrong, but there are 39 malachos d'oraisa. If you would do one of these violations on Shabbos, back in the time the basic understood, you'd have to bring a chatas, do it on purpose, you'd get killed. Muktzah, you'd get lashes, you wouldn't bring a chatas, right? It's much lower. Muktzah is d'rabanan. Muktzah is an institution. We'll see as we continue, like different reasons that may be why muktzah was instituted, but it's basically some safeguard around things which otherwise would be prohibited to ensure that we don't engage in them, and that's why these things are muktzah. But muktzah is not, when we think about Yisrei Shabbos, we need to learn the 39 malachos first. Like borer is far more important than, like, unfortunately is done all the time, and muktzah is again important, but lower on our totem pole, okay? So there is a broad discussion about the parameters of muktzah. As we're going to see, there is one opinion who has a very narrow view of muktzah, very limited, and one is a much broader, includes many more things, okay? And we'll see that debate starting to arise over here. Shemen shel badadin and machzel shel badadin. The olive, the oil pressers, and the mats, the oil pressers. What's the olive, the oil presser? Olive pressers. All the oil is the oil of the olive pressers. What it's referring to is the fact that the people who would push the olives, how would they get paid? They wouldn't get paid by money. What they get paid is that basically poured all the olive oil out of the vat or whatever, and then there's oil on the side. They would get to keep that oil. They'd scoop that oil after they poured out. That would be their payment, right? So if it's something that's involved in payment, so we're going to understand. So you can understand that something involved, like you don't touch money on Shabbos because it's business. So this oil, which is left over, you also don't touch it because it's payment type of oil, even though it's not cash, but it's the equivalent of cash. You don't touch it, okay? So at least and machtal shabbatat, and the mats that they used to cover the vats, which were part of the process of making it, Rav Aser, Shmuel Shari. Rav says it's forbidden, Shmuel says it is permitted. Hani karaki de zuze. Paired mats used for covering a ship's cargo. Again, a similar type of thing, which it's used for business. Rav says it's forbidden. He has a broad understanding of muktzah. Anything that's associated with business at all is going to be forbidden. Ushmuel Shari, whereas Shmuel says it is mutter. Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman gives a whole long list. And again, we're going to see this debate rear its head one more time. Eiz lechalava, a goat which is only used for milk. V'rachali gitzas, and a sheep that's kept for wool. V'tana goat lebeitza, and a hen that's used for its eggs. V'torah de ridia, and ox that's used only for plowing. V'tamar de iska, and dates which are set aside for business. Rav Aser, again, Rav says all those cases, since it's associated with business, we cannot touch it. Shmuel Amar, mutter. Ukmifni meflukta Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Shimon, and their debate, the Amora, Rav and Shmuel, they are arguing in a debate which precedes them between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shimon, who also had this debate about how broadly do we apply the laws of muktzah. Okay, now we have two stories about students doing things. There was a student who ruled in a case in a place called Charta da Arges. It was a location. He ruled like Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon is the one who's more lenient. Shamtir Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna said, you rule like Rav Shimon, he put him in Cherem. Okay, back in the day, Cherem was far more common. He said, basically, you rule like Rav Shimon, how can you do so? He put him in Cherem. Ask the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon Svirlan. The Gemara asked, what's going on? We paskin like Rav Shimon. We actually have a more lenient view of Muktzah. Why did Rav Hamnuna punish his students? The Asri de Rav Have Leibayale Lemevad Hachi, a beautiful and important teaching, and that is that the student was in the city of Rav. Rav is the one who's stringent. When you're in Rome, you act like the Romans. In other words, you can't say, well, it's not my custom. No, when you're in a place where they are acting in a certain way, a certain stringency, you can't say, well, I have the lenience of tradition. Too bad. When you're in a stringent place, you act in the more stringent fashion. You appreciate and you respect the place you're in, and that is the thing you're supposed to do, right? When we have Kiddush over there, and we have, and when they have a quasi-rental, and we join them, and they have separate whatever Kiddush, you're so separate. It's not our thing. Too bad. That's their custom. That's what you're supposed to do when in Rome. So basically, that's why he put him in Cherem, because the fact that he didn't go like he was in a place where that was their custom, and he didn't go with it. And now we have a tangential story about two students who paskin on their own. Hani Trei Talmidei, two students, and there was a fire on Shabbos. Now there is an interesting halacha, and that is that although typically you're allowed to take whatever you need out of, if there's an Erev, you're allowed to take things out of the house on Shabbos. However, Chazal were afraid that if I'm going to start going back and forth into a house on Shabbos, then I'm might go ahead and extinguish the fire. So it's a little counterintuitive. They made a stringency that there's a limitation of how much you're allowed to take out of the house on Shabbos, because if you're going back and forth, you may go ahead, pull that extinguisher and extinguish the fire. Nowadays, I just mentioned parenthetically, we're talking about a house where there's no concern of any life-threatening issues. Nowadays, we assume all fires could potentially lead to a life-threatening situation. You're allowed to extinguish a fire, and theoretically, if you're in a hut in the middle of nowhere and it's not attached by any wiring or anything to any other house, you would have to allow the house to burn down. Again, our house is not that way. If there's a fire, chas v'chalila, you must go ahead and extinguish the fire. Okay. So what are the chad matzah b'chad mana v'chad matzah b'arba v'chamish mana? One kept saved food in one container, the other saved it in 4 or 5 containers. Okay. What's the difference between flukta to Rabba Razav to Rav Huna? They are part of machlokas of Rabba Razav to Rav Huna. We're going to see many dapim from now about a debate between these two Amoraim, and these two tonight went like those two different things. What time is it? Because I don't know my watch. Anyone? 7:40. Let's finish. Let's go to the Mishnah. Beautiful Mishnah. Okay, fine. That new set of halachos. Now we're going to get into the whole idea of making shulam before Shabbos and all the things you're allowed to cook before Shabbos. Very practical halachos. Says the Mishnah. Ein solim basar batal beitza el gdesh solim od yom. You're not allowed to roast meat, onions, or eggs on Friday unless there's time for them to be roasted while it's still day. Right? You're not allowed to put things into the fire into your oven unless it's going to be roasted. What we haven't yet discussed, we'll discuss tomorrow, is how much does it have to be roasted? Does it be fully ready or only partially ready? Okay. Very relevant halachos, especially, fine. Einos and pasta tarim chashecha, you're not allowed to place bread in the oven next to the time it gets dark, okay?
This is not, you're not putting it back in, you're cooking it.
You are baking it. You're baking it for fresh. Yeah, we're not talking about reheating. Correct. That's a whole. Yeah, we're talking about baking it for the first time. Nor a form of a cookie, whatever, on top of coals. Unless there's enough time for the surface to crust while it's still day. Here we start getting a little bit of a measurement that as long as the surface is crusted, as long as the bottom has a crust. Okay, you have to keep in mind, we're going to discuss this more in the Gemara, their ovens, what they would do, the oven we're talking about is the oven where they would smear it with a little bit of oil or whatever it is, and stick it on the wall. So the front actually gets hot before the back, because the front was closer to the fire. The back, nowadays, usually it's the opposite. The fire's coming from the bottom is going to get hot faster, but we're talking about where it's the opposite. Okay, fine. Okay, then here we have here's just a beautiful conclusion of this Mishnah. So what will come out over here is that you can't go ahead and put something in a fire that's not fully ready before Shabbos. Why? Because there's a concern. I may want to make sure it gets ready faster, and I'm going to stoke the coals, and that's why I can't do so. Right? That's the principle. However, 2 amazing exceptions. When it comes to the Karban Pesach, I am allowed to put it. Sometimes you have Pesach, which falls out on Friday night. Okay, and you have to have the Karban Pesach. The Karban Pesach has to be roasted. So you're allowed to place the Karban Pesach in the fire before Shabbos. Now, it's not fully ready. You put it on right before Shabbos, right? It's not just because you're busy. We'll see the reason in a second. You're allowed to put it into the fire right before Shabbos. I'm afraid I'm going to stoke it. We'll see. Further, another example similar, as we'll see, in the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim would be walking around barefoot. Okay, Yerushalayim could be a pretty cold place. And there's stone floors, right? It's freezing sometimes, right? So what would they do? They'd have this big fire. They'd have a room which they had a fire in it. And in that room, they would go ahead and warm themselves up. You're allowed to set that fire before Shabbos. Okay? You're allowed to set that fire before Shabbos. However, Gvulin, but outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you're not allowed to. The fire has to be lit, has to be sufficiently lit that most of it is actually caught on. But if it's less than most of it, you're not allowed to do so. When we're talking about charcoals, which is very easy to light, then even a little bit has to be lit, and then it's fine. Okay? So just a couple of points about this. So first of all, I remember once I was at someone's house, I thought this was the most brilliant contraption until I realized it was completely usher. They had a candle that they lit before Shabbos in their fireplace, and when the candle would finish, it was attached to a wick that went to the fire in the wood in their fireplace. Then they'd start the meal, right, and the little candle would be going, and then they time it basically so when they finish their meal, then the fireplace is like roaring and they're able to go there. I thought it was brilliant. I was like, wow, this is like one of those contraptions you make as a little kid. I was like, this is so cool. Problem is that according to this Mishnah, it's actually usher, right? If you're lighting a fire before Shabbos, you have to make sure that most of the wood would actually be caught on. Right? So, fine, parenthetically. But the thing that's beautiful is, so why is it that the Karban Pesach and the fire in the Beis HaMikdash are exceptions? Why is that? So it's not because they're holy things. You know what the reason is? The reason is because they're done in a group. When you light that fire in the Beis HaMikdash, it's all the Kohanim together. Or you have a Karban Pesach. Karban Pesach, by definition, cannot be eaten alone. Right? Karban Pesach, why? Because it's a big animal, and they split it up amongst a bunch of people, right? So by definition, you have a bunch of people doing it. What we're learning over here, what the Mishnah is teaching us, when you have a group of people, the concern for sin is so much less. When you have a chabura, when you have a group of people, you motivate each other, you keep each other focused, and therefore when you're by yourself, it's a concern, I'm going to mess up. But when you're with a group, then you're able to keep each other together, you're able to keep each other on the straight and narrow, you are not going to mess up. And that's why Chazal teach us that when you light a fire, even though normally I'm concerned about myself, I might stoke the coals, when you're with a big group of people, we're not concerned because the group motivates each other, keeps each other focused, and that is one of the one of the many powers. The Ran, who is it? The Ran writes in Drashos. So the pasuk says that when you have one person by themselves, when you have two people together, they warm each other. Pasuk in Mishlei. Well, it's Mishlei. Cool. Mishlei. It says two people together, they warm each other up. And the Ran points out it's such a funny. It talks about why warming each other up. They should help each other. The point is warming each other up is how do you warm someone up? Even just simply not by doing anything, simply being next to the other person. That, by definition, adds body heat. It adds warmth, right? In other words, the power of a community is not necessarily when we actively go ahead, pick the person up, do something for the person. It's the fact that someone's standing next to me that lifts me up. That gives me the power. That gives me the focus and the energy to do what's right. And that is what this Mishnah is teaching us over here. Just simply by being with other people, that simply reminds us, that elevates us, and that is the beautiful power of community. Have a beautiful day. I look forward to picking up tomorrow. Take care.